Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 29th of October, and today we're going to be talking about the situation in the war between Israel, Hamas, and other Palestinian factions. And we're going to start on the evening of October 27th because there are multiple very important developments that occurred on this specific date. And just to go back to that time, we're going to start off with an announcement by Gaza's largest telecom provider, Palatel. They announced the complete severance of all communication and internet services in Gaza due to particularly intense Israeli bombardment at that time. And 2 days have passed since then, and now the connectivity in Gaza has been partially restored, not to the pre-strike levels. And there's also talk about Starlink providing different aid groups in Gaza with coverage, although that hasn't been in effect yet. And at the same time as Palatel announced these issues, the IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari announced that the Israeli Air Force increased their airstrikes. So we're going to go to some footage. In those strikes that occurred on the night of the 27th, there was really an emphasis on striking the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, especially different tunnel systems. And these tunnel systems, they span dozens of kilometers under Gaza Strip, and they have a depth of 50, 60, 70, 80 meters within that ballpark. And IDF, they claim that on that night, the 27th, they were able to hit 150 underground targets using bunker busting munitions. So here's just some of the footage that they released from those nighttime strikes. Now, the most interesting announcement from Hagari is that he said that the Israeli army is expanding ground activity within the Gaza Strip as of the evening of the 27th. And this announcement came after, give or take, 5 days of Israeli raids. And these were actually localized raids, which were going to make a difference between the raids that happened before 27th and after 27th, because there is a pretty big difference. But just looking at the ones before the 27th that were occurring for a couple of days, you had Israeli raids mainly around the fields to the north and northeast of Beit Hanun. Those were some of the most significant raids, also around Beit Lahia and on the border to the northwest around Asiyafa. Going further south, there were also reports of Israeli raids for multiple days around Bariz refugee camp in Maghazi, so there were some clashes over there as well. And then also to a smaller extent, there were some clashes and raids reported just to the east of Khan Yunis, one of the larger cities within southern Gaza Strip. And there were also reports of Israeli naval commando raids from this unit over here, Shaheed 13, where they attempted landings and raids on Hamas naval compounds on the coast along the city of Rafah. Now, those raids, they lasted a couple of hours, and they were not meant to establish any sort of permanent position. But on the 27th, you had a very large force of tanks and armored vehicles and infantry that launched attacks on multiple different axes, attacking different settlements, neighborhoods, especially on the northern border between Israel and Gaza, especially around Beit Hanun. This is where most of the reports were coming out of, and there was videos of firefights as well. And you could see that at the time, there were reports from the Hamas side where they claimed that an ATGM of theirs was able to destroy an Israeli tank east of Beit Hanun. And there was also the claim circulating that they were able to kill 12 Israeli soldiers, although I didn't see any evidence of that coming after the fact. So what you're seeing here is not a new video. It's actually from the 7th of October. So the only reason why I'm showing this is for illustrative purposes, to show what Hamas is trying to do, especially with these new Israeli attacks where they have these ATGM crews. In this video from the 7th, you had a Hamas and Kornet ATGM that was able to hit that Israeli vehicle specifically. And so you had a lot of the Hamas forces trying to do the same throughout the Israeli attacks starting on the 27th of October. And as a response, you had a lot of Israeli tanks firing onto those ATGM crews, but they were also provided air support. So you had Israeli airstrikes on the ATGM positions. And then you also had a lot of helicopter support targeting positions of Hamas fighters within Beit Hanun, especially where you had a lot of these ATGM crews, sniper nests, etc. So just to go into more detail about the objectives of these Israeli attacks, we could say that at least part of the rationale would be to try to get additional information about the whereabouts of the 230 plus Israeli hostages located within the Gaza Strip right now. But another very important component is destroying the positions of Hamas fighters, and that includes static positions. So that would be different compounds that are located on the outskirts of these populated areas on the northern border and on the eastern border as well. And there's, besides compounds, there are also different buildings that Hamas has booby trapped that the Israelis in different raids tried to demine and tried to actually try to prepare for later taking over during a ground invasion. And there's also a lot of mobile Hamas positions that are being targeted, as we said before, ATGM crews, sniper nests, and very importantly, rocket and mortar launchers. So you have a lot of these rocket positions that are firing from the northeastern fields, just to the northeast of Beit Hanun. And this is like a forward operating base for these rocket launchers where they could reach deeper into Israel. They could reach into the Jerusalem area, especially. That's where you see a lot of the strikes onto Jerusalem in the wider area being fired from, but also because it's so north in comparison to other parts of Gaza, you could also fire onto like the wider Gush Dan metropolitan area, or even further north onto cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, or you could also fire just to the east to some of these other Israeli towns. But there's also the component of mortar fire, because the mortar fire, in most cases, as you can see via red alerts, it's targeted at different settlements that are just adjacent to the Gaza Strip within the Gaza envelope. And the objective of the Hamas fighters when they launch these mortars is to target the Israeli buildup of tanks and reservists, because there's just a massive concentration of Israeli forces right now within many different bases in open fields adjacent to these different villages in the Gaza envelope. And the objective of Hamas would be to try to disrupt that buildup and try to cause some damage before the Israeli columns are even able to enter into Gaza Strip itself. So you could see that the areas just to the northeast of Beit Hanun, they're perfect mortar positions to fire onto an Israeli buildup around Sderot or around these other positions over here around Erez, for instance. So that's just some of the rationale in destroying those positions by launching a ground incursion. But that's not the full story for why Israel is now trying to conduct a permanent advance, because they have now withdrawn from the positions that they took over on the evening of October 27th, 2 days later. They've actually increased the amount of land that they've taken since then, albeit at a very slow pace and only in areas that are not really populated at all anymore. There's also the factor of trying to identify tunnel entrances. That's going to be very important for Israel. A lot of tunnel entrances are around the northern border with the Gaza Strip, because you want to have Hamas fighters that are able to reach very, very close to the Israeli border without being identified. So that's why there are entrances that are pretty close to the border, and Israel is now looking for some of them. So for instance, in this video, what you could see is there's Israeli Caterpillar D9 armored bulldozers and Puma armored engineering vehicles, and they're clearing paths and various pieces of rubble that are just scattered around the border. And this is in order to make way for the Israeli columns of Merkava 3s, Merkava 4s, Nemer APCs, and various other different vehicles that are involved in advancing along the coastal areas in the northwestern parts of the Gaza Strip. So we're going to actually look at some footage of that now. So here you can see footage of a Merkava Mark III and Merkava Mark IV, and various of them, these main battle tanks, and they're in northern Gaza, supported by Nemer APCs as well, and mechanized infantry that is dismounted. And in order to provide concealment for the mechanized infantry, you could see the Merkava 3s, they created a smoke screen for them as they advance through these open fields. They're not entering into the heavily populated neighborhoods like Beit Hanun yet, due to fears of just massive casualties, especially in terms of vehicles. So they're still just operating in the areas that would be in open fields, like agricultural areas, trying to clear out any sort of Hamas presence over there, despite the fact that you do have instances of Hamas fighters that conduct raids onto the Israeli positions that are within the Gaza Strip, which has led to multiple different reports of firefights. And according to Israel, so this is what they're saying, they're claiming that they were able to repel every single one of these Hamas attacks. It could also be that these Hamas attacks are not meant to take back land, but just to try to cause casualties to the Israeli forces. Here we can see the Israeli strikes onto the basically the city of Beit Hanun. And what you'll notice, and it's more present in satellite imagery, is that almost all the structures within the city are just decimated or have suffered some sort of damage. And especially what you'll see is that within this city compared to other ones that are further south, like Gaza City or Khan Yunis, this one has been targeted the most as a relative size because it does have a population of 30,000. So it's not that big compared to the other settlements. But in relative terms, it has been targeted very heavily. And that's because Israel does most likely want to clear out any sort of Hamas positions that could be used right now or in the future in order to make this area a forward operating point for them to conduct attacks even deeper into the Gaza Strip later. And that's also why they're trying to establish permanent position within the fields now. So they'll have a perimeter surrounding Beit Hanun before they go in. Going in even now would be extremely difficult because you can see that the structures, they are still standing even though there is damage to them. There's a lot of apartment buildings in this area, narrow alleyways, and there's also tunnel systems over here. So if there's an Israeli strike, then the Hamas fighters are definitely seeking cover over there. And speaking of the tunnel systems, today there was a report from the Israeli side where they claimed that they were able to repel an attempted Hamas infiltration into Israel again. What happened was they emerged from a tunnel opening that is a couple hundred meters away from the Erez crossing. Erez crossing was taken over by the Hamas forces, if you recall, on day one of the war. And that basically the goal was to reach this area. This is an area where you have a lot of the IDF equipment that's crossing through, especially along Salah al-Din Road and some of the surrounding fields. And so this was most likely an attack on those positions and an attempt to also infiltrate into the Israeli rear. This is something that Hamas has been doing since day one, even after they were pushed back from the Gaza envelope. They still tried to conduct these types of raids into Israeli territory. And in this case, the Israelis claim that the 79th Battalion of the 14th Brigade of the 252nd Sinai Division was able to repel that attack. But this just gives you an idea of the fact that the Hamas forces are still able to operate in the areas to the north of Beit Hanun, albeit now much of this area is now a gray zone where you can't have a permanent position established. And finally, looking at the Israeli advances today, you had the Israelis advancing about 3 kilometers from the border, taking over the As Siafa resort town. So this is an area with a lot of different beach resorts just on the coast of Gaza. And it's an area that does not have much of any population right now. Most of them have fled southwards. And even if there were people over here, this is not a really dense area in comparison to the neighborhoods that you see further south, like in Jabalia. So this is an area that's pretty safe in comparison for the IDF to enter. And there's a lot of footage of the IDF columns that are advancing over here, and they're very, very clustered together. There's very little concern for whether a Hamas force could just fire onto all of them and cause massive amounts of havoc. And that's just a testament to the imbalance in terms of firepower that Israel has in comparison to the Hamas forces. But either way, the Hamas forces do still have certain capabilities when it comes to like ATGM cruiser drones, but it would be nowhere enough to cause destruction to the IDF columns within these open fields now. It's a totally different question if they enter right now into the populated neighborhoods, which is why I don't think they're going to do that for a while. But in terms of the broader questions, it's going to have to be whether the IDF continues with this current strategy, whether they're going to open up similar sort of gradual advances through open fields and other fronts. That's something that really only time will tell us. Here's an image of Israeli soldiers raising a flag above a recreation center on the northern Gaza coast. And then here we have a geolocated marker of Israeli tanks that were expanding the ground operations. And this is based on thermal imagery. So this was during the nighttime. And this is also on the northern Gaza coast, which is pretty close to the more populated neighborhood of Hatatra, which is now contested. Although right now we're not seeing any serious attempts at trying to take over this neighborhood. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.